Thank you very much, Claudia and the other organizers, for the invitation. It's a great pleasure and also honor to be invited as a PhD in art history to a summer school in computational social science. For the audience on the web, wearing shorts indicates it's really hot here. So the interesting thing for this whole circumstance is that what I'm doing is I work with cultural products. That means either artworks, but it could also any other cultural production, which means I don't focus on people. So I'm usually not interested in the individuals, I'm usually not interested in the social network, but I'm interested in the waste product of this social network. And the interesting thing about this is that if you go down into history, into the past, that's usually what you have. All you have from Neolithic cultures is their artifacts, right? You can talk to them. You have obviously remains of their bodies and stuff like that, and you can make maybe conclusions about their social networks, but actually you have to look at the artifacts. And that's usually something that's excluded. We will talk about that. I already get the question right before when I put that slide up. Many of you in the audience will now ask the question, what is Warburg? Actually, the question is, who is Warburg? Abby Warburg was the heir of the Warburg Bank, and he gave the bank, which is one of the largest German banks before World War II, to his younger brothers, and he said, I want to buy any book I want. And the brothers said yes. He was 12 or 13 at that point in time. His brother said yes, but he didn't come out to them how many books he will buy. And so he built one of the largest and most curious and weirdest art libraries, and sort of fundamentally transformed the notion of cultural history. And actually, he was working closely with a philosopher called Ernst Cassirer, who I was told by a reviewer last week is as dead as a doornail, which remains of the nail of Christ, on nails of Christ on the cross, which is also in line with the fact that Cassirer, after World War II, was called an immigrant philosopher. That's the reason people didn't study him in Germany. And before the war, he was a Jewish philosopher. And that's the reason he had to emigrate. But he had something to say, and there's a lot of stuff pre-World War II that is super relevant for us today. Actually, what I will talk about today will have less pictures than my talk have usual, more words. And the interesting thing is it has the potential to integrate computer science or computation, network science, higher order topology, and art and cultural history. This sounds like a really pretentious premise, but it's actually true. And it's not my contribution, I just read up on it and basically put the pieces together. And then the other interesting thing we obviously need to talk about is this big elephant in the room, deep learning, machine learning, looking at multimedia data. So we come together here in the Computational Social Science School to talk about how we work with multimedia data, which usually results in this thing that the images are related to people, like portraits, right? Like, so there's sort of a kind of equation or close proximity of the picture to the person. Other things we do is we put them on a map. We look at the geographic distribution in urban space. We literally did that in the last couple of days, right? But one of the premises I make here is that there's this other space, there's multidimensional thought space, there's other order, other things we can do other than just looking at basically which people is it tied to and what's the actual dynamics in the real world. There is a dynamics going on of cognition. And so this is basically what this whole realm is about. So who is Abby Warburg? Abby Warburg not only built a library, he had a notorious way of working, which ended up in a product called the Memnossyne-Atlas. And what you see on the left is a plate, it's plate 46, the most famous plate from the Memnossyne-Atlas. And what this brings together is pictures of this lady, which is Ghiberti's so-called nymph, which is a painting. And so there's a woman with like draped dress, and she carries something on her head and walks like this. And if you would look at all the other pictures, there is iterations of this, which is pretty interesting. And he has other plates where he has he combines like Apollo in a Roman sculpture and some dude in a male underwear advertising in Hamburg in 1922. And he's standing there in the same pose. And you may say, this means nothing, but it actually means something. It actually sort of transports this kind of same pathos, that's what how A.B. Warburg called that. And you may find it curious that this thing sort of prefigures, in a literal sense, this. So what you see here is a Pinterest board. Actually, it's an algorithmically created one. So one user picked the image up here, which, by the way, shows a lady with a draped dress, which is not sort of posed and has the pathos of a nymph, but has the pathos of victory. Actually, victory is standing right behind her with the same dress. And so somebody tweeted that, you know, Beyoncé and Jay-Z take over the damn Louvre in the video apeshit, and then Pinterest says, like, okay, here is a selection of images that are related to that. So algorithmically, this produces the same thing, and you can see lots of different things. Like, this thing is really curious, right? So she wears this dress, and it flows in this kind of thing, and you can say, okay, interesting, how does this end up, and how is it connected to all other things? So here we find a manual version. This takes years of work, and this is sort of done in like 1 second. It's really interesting, right? And we would consider the social media, but of course we know it's also used for trend analysis and images and whatever. But the theories behind them, these two things are closer related than you actually think. So how did I end up doing what I'm doing? Only 2 slides. So I was a student in art history, classical archaeology, and I worked at the Glyptothek in Munich, where I worked with stuff like this. We had 500 sculptures, and over time people produced completions because noses tend to break up, they stick out. So if the sculpture does this, nose break off, and then people produce different noses. So I had things like boxes that said, this is Italian, it means noses. There were other body parts that stick out, which I had to sort and like run around in the museum and like, does it fit here and stuff like that. So draped sculptures like this thing, the ridges tend to break off. So the most famous, one of the most famous classic sculptures called the Arenik Hephaestodot had 361 fragments missing, but the photos of the fragments missing, which are somewhere in a box, are still used to teach students what classical style is. So that's the kind of thing. And I was allowed to touch all of this. And not only that, at some point I made the suggestion and said, like, hey, let's do an electronic inventory where we can actually preserve the multiplicity of opinion. And that's how I ended up doing my other job, which is much more weird for an art historian, which is we had some data, which now we can visualize, back then we didn't, we put it in a database, ends up looking like this. This is a small record in a graph database. This describes a column base with some decoration around it, architectural ornament. So this is what you would have in the background. What you would see would be something like where it says card, like tiny little piece of text. And all this is produced from that when you open or query the record. And how does this work? There's obviously some queries that need to go out and walk through the graph. That's actually exactly what Facebook also does. And we had to write that in a weird kind of query language. And I just give you a little taste that the first 10 years of my professional life, this is what I did. Like this thing here writes these first 5 lines. And so you have to do this for many other things, and many records don't look like this. There is, in essence, so some records, the monument by itself has 500 parts, and then there's documents and whatever, so you run into latency problems, and there's all sorts of stuff you can run into. And so for me, this obviously, in German there's a word called Verbildung, which means sort of diseducation. So you have some education which nobody else can use and bends your mind in some direction. So I still, to this day, have some of these numbers in my head, which are reference numbers in the graph, like 000, 010, 150, 100, 060, which is a node type. And so the key thing is, like, if you start thinking about graphs in that way, you get a really good feeling about how network works, but you have nobody to talk to, right? So I at some point said, I want to combine these two things, do my PhD, and prove that there is complex structure in these networks, so we can do network complexity science of networks in art history. And so basically that's what I did. In the last year, actually, and you could say in the last 10 years, but particularly in the last year, this starts to take off in a very weird way. So we can now do art history as a systematic science. And so I want to give you a quote which is old. Actually, it was issued in the first issue of Nature. Huxley, who was Darwin's bulldog, which you know from other things, he put together aphorisms from Goethe, where he explains basically what the Nature journal should do, because obviously nobody could look up what Nature journal should do. And he talks about we, meaning humans, are in nature and nature is in us. This is an argument that social science should be part of the journal. But he also says this sentence, because even the most unnatural is still nature, which basically means the humanities should be in there too, right? And so the key thing is that this was never heard, like, for a very long time, and then it started happening around 10 years ago, and actually most of us who do data science were really shocked by this paper, right? The Google Ngram paper, shocked in various ways because Steven Pinker is on it, and Google provided the data. The paper doesn't have that much, it's pretty straightforward what they do. It's really cool, or was cool, because now we talk about the bias in the data set, but still, it's still cool. But it stopped many of us in our tracks. It happened December 16, 2010, and I stopped working for 3 days. Because I was working on a data set that was like obviously way smaller. We were up to similar things, and then the key thing was like, okay, like here comes Google with all the data. There's no way to compete, right? Like there's probably more coming out like this. So for us, it worked actually out. We had this little thing, which is also about cultural data. It's actually about locations, interestingly. We use person data to look at a network of locations of people moving from A to B. And the interesting thing about this is that this is a hack, right? We look at social data to say something about cultural centers. And then it was titled by science as quantitative social science. This may be one of the reasons I'm here, but it took them another 8 years to actually title a cultural paper culture, which is really interesting. And this happened in the last 3 years, in the last year, sorry. There were 3 papers. One is Hot Streaks by Dashun Wang in Artistic, Culture, and Scientific Careers. And so he looks at artists and compares them to scientists who happen to have these hot streaks. So this was a science paper, a nature paper, sorry. In science, a little bit later, there was this paper quantifying artists' careers and success in art. So here every dot is a gallery in the world. And there's a connection between galleries if an artist has exhibited here and then exhibits later in another gallery. So you can actually see the hierarchical structure of importance. And you can also figure out if you don't know Hans Ulrich Obrist and you're Indian, you will never make it to Gagosian Gallery, which is really bad. It also means that the art world does not really cover the awesome artists of the world, because in many regions there is interesting artists which are not covered in the system. And then there is this, which came out in PNAS, which is a comparison of the complexity, actually what's called Birkhoff Complexity, which is sort of the order and the entropy of an image on a 10 pixel by 10 pixel level. And this is sufficient to actually cluster the known artistic styles in a meaningful way. So if you look closer, you can actually see that this picture, this clustering, based on this teeny tiny measure of comparing 10 by 10 pixel windows on images, is sufficient to actually retrieve the history of art. So they made it to PNAS. So here's a question. What's the difference between 1, 2, 3, 4 and this? This is about objects, exactly. So what's really the radical transformation here is these things talk about the lives, or this talks about words. This is more or less based on or talking about the lives of the artists, which is literally the title of the oldest art history book people refer to, which is Vasari's Lives of the Artists, 1560 something. And so the interesting thing is this talks about objects. And so I just show you one picture. This is what art historians do, okay? I don't care about words. I don't care about people. I don't care about artist attributions. I don't care about dates, usually. But to figure out that this thing is an inverse theology, it's an inverse pietà. The bad guy holds his own mother that is veiled, right? Walks out the door, so this is Darth Vader and his mother, in the very same position as the pietà of Michelangelo. Right? It's like first George Lucas should not be allowed to sue anybody for anything, I can tell you. There's like, you can do gazillions of those. And so the really interesting thing is this kind of family resemblance stuff, because there is meaning transported. Like, obviously, if you're not aware that this is going on, right? But there is, as Warburg says, pathos. This thing is more meaningful because people have used it so much than basically just somebody carrying out the mutter. There is so many things that play into this. There's like a leather strap somewhere, which reminds of like some Robbie having a leather strap hanging out. It's pretty amazing. So this is totally a religious iconography. And so the key question is, how can we do this? They used the image data set of 140,000 images. How long does it take to look at 140,000 images? If you look at every image 3 seconds each, which is a moment, cognitive scientists think, 21 days. If you look at 8,000 pictures a day. You need to be sort of trained, I can tell you, because like after 3,000 images, you get really bored. But after doing this a while, you can look at 8,000 images, and it takes you 21 days. How long would it take to do a pairwise comparison where you look at 2 images each, like in this case, for 140,000 images? 95 years, right? So the computer can do it. Humans can do it. So this, you can tell if these were made by a machine or by a human. I can tell you this is made by a machine, but I have similar pictures that were made by students. It's very easy, actually. So it's not that hard. But you can see it's now possible to sort together images by family resemblance. And that should take us further so we can actually do what Warburg did on a much larger scale. Actually, indeed, this is the 140,000 images from that data set. And we basically just process this through ResNet 50, like very standard. You learned the pipeline like 3 times, and tomorrow or later today, we learned it probably a 4th time. So you put it into this machine learning algorithm in ResNet 50. You assign a vector because it's not cats and automobiles and airplanes, which is the usual words you get at. And then you use that vector. You calculate some similarity distance or whatever, and that distance measures you embed in some low-dimensional space, in this case 2-dimensional, in this case t-SNE. You could use UMAP or principal component analysis and whatever. You fold it down, and this is the picture you're looking at. And then you can zoom in, and this is actually the zoomed-in picture. This is like literally just taken randomly. I take little squares from that picture. But what's the problem with this? It's huge. That's one problem? Yeah, that's true. So that makes sense. So here's all the black and white pictures. The blue spot up here is all mountains that are sort of this blue sky. This is also colorful mountains, which are in wiki art. Nobody knows why. There's portraits somewhere, so it really makes sense. But there's a huge problem. How about a portrait with mountains in the background? Where do you put it? Here or there, right? So the key point is t-SNE puts it here or there. And if there's 3 things in the picture, it puts it here or there or that other place. Because this is 2-dimensional. And the similarity space is multidimensional, right? So this vector space is multidimensional. Actually, if you have 1,000 numbers in the output vector, you could safely assume that maybe it's 1,000-dimensional. We have no idea. But it's totally more than 3. And this is a huge problem because this actually means we have to learn how to understand this space. Actually, a big thing Mauro is doing when he talks about Gantt space and he follows images that look similar, what he does, he's walking in that space. And you don't see all of it, but it actually may give you a better idea of what the actual structure of that space is, right? And so what we are looking at, or what I'm after, is actually trying to understand that multidimensional space. And I try to convince you in the next 45 minutes that that multidimensional space is equivalent to what Ernst Cassirer calls thought space. And thought space is multidimensional, purely geometric. It's a relational space. It may be metric. Here, this is metric because every image has a coordinate in this XY space. And it's also metric because what the neural network spits out is numbers, right? So you get like 1,000 numbers, so that's a 1,000-dimensional coordinate. So now the interesting thing is that you can be more general, and you can say, okay, I have 1,000 numbers plus I put something else in a cell, right? And that may not necessarily be a number. You may be able to convert it into a number. But so the key thing is this may be more complicated. We may be able to think things which are not quantified. Okay, but that's a complicated one. So before we get into this Ernst Cassirer thing, let's talk a little bit about, again, why I am here. I'm an art historian, and why so many people think I shouldn't be here. I can tell you more. Humanists think I shouldn't be here. So here's these two words, complication and complexity. Humanists often tell you in funding reviews, in job interviews, in paper reviews, straight to the face, quantification in the humanities doesn't work. Because in the humanities, everything is special. The humanities are ideographic. That's how a philosopher called Windelband called it, basically meaning to say that every event in history, like us sitting together here, are non-reproducible. The next time we sit together here, it's different, right? Because one of us has to pee or, whatever. So the key thing is about this, this is contrasted to this other thing, the other world of the two worlds, which is the nomothetic disciplines, like physics. Like every air molecule in this room does the same thing, right? It's like more or less, they don't bunch up over there. It's like, I starve these people now, right? So they all choke. So basically there's this idea that these two worlds are separate. And how bad it is, you can see like a couple of weeks ago, Science had a special issue on the two worlds by C.P. Snow, 50th year anniversary. There was an article, and the editorial of that Science magazine issue did not get over to use the word culture. They talked around it, and the word culture is something like a word you don't use. They talk about social science and whatever, and it's really weird to talk about the two worlds and not use the word humanities and the word culture. It's really, really weird, okay? So how does this go together? You all know this picture, right? I guess. So this is an XKCD comic, fields arranged by purity. And as you can see, art history, cultural studies, not there, right? So there is, sociology is just applied psychology, psychology is just applied biology, biology is just applied chemistry, which is just applied physics. It's nice to be on top, right? And they don't think about mathematicians. So does anybody have an idea who has not seen a talk I've given about this, where this comes from? What does this refer to, other than being really funny? If I tell you it's a paper, and it's a paper many in the room actually have read, I'm pretty sure, because if you do complexity, you've probably read this. It's very short, there's no math in it. Okay, so here's the thing. The elementary entities of science X obey the laws of science Y, but this hierarchy does not imply that science X is just applied Y. The XKCD comic is literally a comic version of this, right? So, but neither Anderson nor XKCD actually add cultural studies behind social sciences. But the German tradition, actually the Austrian tradition, does. So this is from Rupert Riedel, who wrote The Fauna of the Adriatic. He was a diver and an ecologist, and he, at the end of his life, wrote this book called Strukturen der Komplexität, which means structures of complexity, which you have to take with a grain of salt. At this age, he sort of didn't cite anything that was newer than 1980, which is sort of a problem of the book, but nevertheless, he comes up with this. And so this is German, but it doesn't matter. So here you have your fields, just like in the XKCD comic, and here you have the subjects of the fields, which feels almost the same, but it's not. And he says, like, biology, for example, does a lot of things from molecules to behavior. So there you have whole bodies, and here you have molecules. So you can see that actually if you span it out as a matrix, there is a confusion going on along the diagonal. And the disciplines are not that discrete, actually, but they sort of overlap. So there's biochemistry that does both chemistry and biology in some sense. Sociology, as we have seen, deals with multimedia images. But there is a whole section of fields that actually do nothing but that. Because you cannot sufficiently talk about the similarity of paintings and the meaning and whatever if you focus on questionnaires in social science all the time. So you need to stare at images. So that's the reason why there is this thing, Kulturwissenschaft, which means cultural science stricto sensu, which in other words, he explains that in the text, means you actually deal with the objects. Like you excavate stuff and then you compare pot charts, in essence. So this would basically mean that in this there's a hierarchy of complexity where every field, like the granular stuff in one field, comes together. The local activity of these granular entities basically results in the basic phenomenon of the higher up thing. So whatever we produce as cultural products has a complex structure due to our local activity, and then there is a field that actually studies this, right? And so the interesting thing is that this puts art history at the end of a spectrum, which we all know, in complexity science at least, which goes all the way from atoms, molecules, and genes. So this is from a wonderful review paper by Topol in Cell called From Pre-Womb to Tomb. I can never forget that name again. So where you can see there is this hierarchy, obviously from genes and to cells, to multicellular organisms, all the way, and then they have this really uncanny, weird picture that is like from a, it looks like from a PR agency, right? The meaning of this is like, oh, there's humans are thinking and cognition and whatever. But again, here there's the cultural products are missing, which is really interesting. But so we put ourselves in that kind of sequence. Up on the upper register, you see the same thing again. There's this hierarchy again. But what's also interesting, within that hierarchy, entangled with it, there is all these types of networks, right? And so, now I shock you a little, I guess. This is the networks in art history. There's 88 link types. The matrix is the data model. So, for example, you have monument documentation. Actually, let me do the next slide. There's monument documentation. This is a small database. My PhD is on that cell of that matrix of a larger network. Our science paper on people moving from birth to death location is actually born out of this picture. This picture shows you that people who are antiquarians, 300 of them or 250, are born all over Europe and they all die in Paris, Rome, or Dresden, or 80% of them. Dresden has a large antiquity collection. It's like, okay, this is not random. How does it look for 100,000 people? 6 months later, we had data sets, and that's what led to the science paper. And you can see there's many other, like what's this? This is monument time. So this is the date of monuments. And you can see, okay, so the number of monuments that are signed to a period is also heavy-tail distributed. Bad news, that means the timeline is as empty as the map of tourist photos. But now you need to know that also the period length you attribute the date to is heavy-tail distributed. There's lots of stuff where we say, oh, 16th century. There's very little stuff where we say August 31st, 1614, right? Because that kind of information we usually don't have. We don't have cell phone call detail records in history. But nevertheless, we can look at stuff like this and figure out the distributions actually are the same as with cell phone call detail records. That's pretty scary and weird. Okay. So that takes me to this other thing. I hope I have convinced you by now that as an art historian, I can do complexity science. So now the key question is, why is it so hard? And that's a social question. So I call this, actually, a chapter in the book I'm currently writing, which is called Cultural Interaction, the book, and I hope it will come out soon. So there's a chapter which I call the multidisciplinary ski area. What do I mean with this? So this is a map of co-occupation, over 2 million people in Wikidata. So we download them all, and then Wikidata has this occupation field, and you can look at co-occupation. And we did the very same thing you saw 2 days ago, I think twice by now. We did backbone, the whole thing. We did community finding. And so this is sort of the core network. Actually, the person I worked with here, who did most of the work, is Doron Goldfarb, who's a PhD student, or was a PhD student at the time. He's brilliant and works with semantic data in a really good way. And so now let me zoom out. This is what I am. This is what I do. Okay? Actually, Archaeology and art history, this is where I am. There's a tiny little community. This green community is the people who work with objects. Architectural historians, art historians, archaeologists, anthropologists, Egyptologists, prehistorians. It means historians before there is writing. The functional degree of separation, that's something to digest, is how long in this network? What do you think? 1. Actually, it's probably less than 1 because most people are not co-occupied. Most people don't have 2 disciplines. And I had an anthropologist joking about that and somebody else another anthropologist complaining about the fact. He said, like in anthropology, the functional degree of separation is 0 because anthropologists don't talk to other anthropologists on the other side of the hall, right? So you can imagine how many anthropologists and how many art historians actually talk to mathematicians and physicists and computer scientists. By the way, sociology is here. You're disconnected from these guys too. And how many of us actually work in graphic design? How many of us take drawing a figure so serious that you actually think about the design principles? These guys are up there. So these guys talk about images, and the people who produce the images are up there. And as you know, we are here in a community where people draw figures that are super serious about it. Either some of us actually have studied at Politecnico di Milano, and a lot of people work with people from Politecnico di Milano. And once you do this for 10 years, you probably sort of know what's going on. Now, imagine yourself looking as an editor for peer reviewers who have to look for a peer reviewer who is able to look at a paper that has an art history topic, or a sociology topic for that matter, that uses serious new ways how to visualize things, does a mathematical model, and computes something with HPC. What do? You get 4 reviewers from these different fields, and they all say, that's not what I'm doing. That's not computer science. That's not physics. That's not art history. And if your PhD is in art history, you're dead, right? Because if the other says that's not computer science, you're done, because your art history colleagues will never say this is art history, right? And so the key thing is, this thing is really dangerous. This is why I call this a ski area and this backcountry skiing. We do these things and we slowly build a community, and computational social science, congratulations, we made it. This means you guys and girls who write PhDs in this area and papers have a generation of people that is now around 40 who will review you, who already does what you do. There is journals that do that. The same thing is true for network science. You can write network science papers that are multidisciplinary, but for whatever reason, if you go to the high impact journals, the editor will invite an art historian or a historian or whatever, and that guy will still say it doesn't work because quantification in humanities doesn't work, right? So this is super, super risky business in essence. Okay, so with that, let me look at time. Okay, so with that, let me switch to this historical foundation. So obviously, I was asked 2 years ago by a guy called Rick Bretel, who brought in $32 million, a 450,000 volume library, and 2 major art collections to UT Dallas. So he approached me and he said, Max, I want you to explain to humanists what you're actually doing and that it makes sense in a book, because they read books. So I pay you a year, you can do it wherever you want. And I said, like, okay, there's 2 options, either the desert, preferably one with complexity scientists in them, or an art history library. And he said, yeah, I want you to write it in Munich, which has the largest art history library. I said, yeah, that's good. My daughter sees my mother. So it's okay. So I'm going to do that. So I wrote that book. And so this is the first chapter, Cultural Analysis Cetus. And it's the first chapter in Cultural Interaction. That's the book. That article is out because there was no way sending this to peer review. That's maybe a little risky, but the key thing is, like, the things I say in there, they have sort of very short and easy to scoop priority. Like sometimes you have to just drop it, right? Fun fact, this was a desk rejection in Archive, okay? So if you want to know that, there is people who are on a list in Archive that, because they're supposedly too far out, they get desk rejected in Archive. There's no network scientist in Archive in that board. There is Yuri Leskovich among the computational scientists, but he probably didn't see it. And as you know, Mauro, right? You look at new papers, where you look? Archive. If you're not in there, you're not in there. So all you have is your Twitter stream. It's pretty crazy. So I'm not the only one. There's many people like that. I get some papers accepted in Archive, it's okay, but some others not. The key point is it's theoretical. They don't like theory that is that kind of theory. Yes?
I also got once.
Yeah?
But the reason was because I made a mistake in classifying the paper.
Oh, yeah.
Which category you select?
Sociophysics, right? That's where like all the network science papers end up. So yeah, which by the way, so there's another interesting thing. The sociophysics category is not moderated by sociophysicists. It's a regular physicist who does this. And there's no way to complain. There's no email. It's a little bit like certain stages in immigration, right? So this is the summary. In essence, network science, topological data analysis, computation, and art history all go back to Leibniz. 3 of those, like network science, topological data analysis, and art history, to the same 8 lines. Okay? And I do so via network science, via graph theory and Euler, 1736. Topological data analysis via Poincaré. Computation via, does anybody know that Shannon paper? You all know information theory, right? This is his master thesis. This is the base for circuit diagrams in electrical engineering. He did it as his master thesis, crazy. And basically what he did, he looked at the algebra form logic of Couturat, which is rooted in Leibniz, and basically drew pictures. That's the power of pictures. And art history basically is connected, this particular art history of Abby Warburg, and this other method, which also comes out of the Warburg school called iconology, goes back to Ernst Cassirer. Not the philosophy of symbolic forms, which people who know him in 1927 would say, but an obscure article where he summarized his kind of theory. So let's start. Let's do one after the other so you get an idea of how this all is connected. This is Königsberg. You all know the Königsberg bridge problem. So there's 7 bridges. Can you walk them without crossing a single bridge twice? Okay? So this is a picture of 1652, I think, by a guy called Merian. And I want to point to a very curious fact. There's reference letters here. Symbolic reference letters that point to particular parts of the city. This is not something that's usual. At that point, it's 100 years old already. But the key thing is, like, Euler picked up on that when he created this picture, which uses symbolic reference letters to refer to islands or parts of land and the bridges, like small reference letters and large reference letters. So he didn't come out of nowhere, right? Nevertheless, in network science, we say, okay, this paper is the birth, the start, the foundational moment, or one of the oldest proof of network science and the birth of graph theory. Like, why do I take issue with birth, start, and whatever? This is the first sentence. And the first sentence says, besides the part of geometry which is concerned with quantities and developed all the time with the highest interest, the other part is still very much unknown, first mentioned by Leibniz, called Geometriam Situs. So literally, there's like one citation in that paper. It's literally in sentence 1. And it's like, and nobody goes and it's like, I want to read Leibniz. Like, you know, that's what historians do. I want to read that piece. So what does he refer to? So here's the difficulty. Leibniz has this vast body of manuscripts. It's so vast that people took until like 1980 something to sort of catalog it all, until very recently to sort of make it accessible. And so the 4 people I was talking about, plus Bertrand Russell, were literally the only 5 people who read through all the mathematical manuscripts. That's the reason these people are so important. And so basically, you can go back and say, okay, where does Euler have this idea from? And Leibniz published some stuff, including, as you know, calculus, right? His Mathesis Universalis. And the interesting thing about it is, this is one of the ironies of history, it's the introduction to calculus. And in that, he says, this other 6-liner is actually down here. This is the translation of Ernst Cassirer. Mathematics hereby is not the general science of magnitude, but of form, not of quantity, but of quality. Combinatorics hereby becomes the proper foundational science if one does not understand it as the doctrine of number, of connections of given elements, but as the universal representation of possible kinds of relation and their mutual dependence. the last line is an interpretation of Cassirer that becomes very important because their dependent citation, right, and kinds of relation in general include similarity. Leibniz calls this order, similarity, relations expressed in a universal way. Like he sort of, paints around it, but it's very clear if you read the rest that this is what he means. So he basically says, here I give you a book to learn calculus, but by the way, math shouldn't be about number, it should be about relations. But then he didn't publish that, but he thought all his life about it, and in the end of his life, he writes down this piece, which he basically calls the foundation of things, of mathematical things in metaphysics, and he has an alternative title which is called De Calculo Situm. And this is the definition. We only read 2 lines. Space is the order of existence, of coexistence, and situs is the mode of coexistence. So what he says is you have 2 nodes, there's no relation yet. These 2 nodes constitute space. And that's it. There's no distance, no extension. You can add that, but that's what you need. All you need is things coexisting or in positions. And so basically if this doesn't remind you of a matrix with like IDs, then I don't know. So basically, Leibniz's definitions from first principles allows for qualitative coexistence, including a definition of space without or at least preceding a notion of extension or magnitude. We may also add, at least in Cassirer's interpretation, that not only space but also form is defined without or in opposition to magnitude. This is super important. Form is not the same as shape. Okay? And that takes us to topology in a second. So this is the summary. Leibniz has positions and relations, situs and then the relations. Forget about situation, it should be there. Euler has graphs, vertices, and edges, right? Or not Euler, but the graph theory that follows Euler. Network science, networks, node, and links. And what Cassirer makes out of it is symbolic forms, symbols, and symbolic relations. And now what's important is that networks, nodes, and links are a subset of symbolic forms, symbols, and symbolic relations. Because, can you imagine another symbolic form or another symbolic relation other than a link? Dots? Triangles, encliques, simplices, simplicial complexes. So higher order topology is part of that definition. And Cassirer actually reads all these mathematicians and actually talks about it in a very similar way as Poincaré, who comes up with this higher order topology. And he does never, ever tell you that he was in charge of editing Leibniz's manuscripts, and then he never edited them. He read them. He said like, yeah, too confused, but really useful, and he wrote his own analysis situs. He even called it analysis situs. And only in 1910, he wrote this piece called The Future of Mathematics in The Monist, which is a very famous and important philosophy journal, where he basically outs himself by putting all the elements in that Leibniz sort of brings to fruit. I want to return a little to this shape thing. So the key thing about this is you can have a network of dots that are related to each other, and as you all know, you can draw it as a node link diagram and you can draw it as a matrix. You can permutate the matrix or you can shuffle around the nodes. The information of connection does not change. So these 4 depictions have a different shape but the same form. They literally show the same network, right? And that's an important thing. So there is a representation that is not a depiction, that is symbolic, and that's basically what we're talking about. Okay, so Cassirer as the missing link. How does this happen? So Ernst Cassirer, it's important to talk a little bit about like how he formed. So I can give you a bridge between what I told you at the beginning, Abby Warburg, my own art history, and this weird thing of higher order or pure mathematics. So he basically goes through a number of stages. He starts out with his PhD sort of, or like his first book called Leibniz System and its Scholarly Foundations. Second thing, Substance and Function. So he basically says in 1910 in this book, Substance and Function, that it's not about structure, it's all about relations. That's like every field that has made the transition towards network science has said that at some point, right? It's about like how stuff is connected. It's not about people, it's about how people are connected. That's social network analysis. And so the interesting thing is he said that in 1910. Then he wrote a book on Einstein's theory of relativity, which was proofread by Einstein, sort of explaining it to philosophers. That was translated to English. And then at that point, he joins the Warburg library. Actually, he walks in the door into this weird library of Abbey Warburg, and he looks around and he says, oh my God, I have to either leave or I will be stuck for 15 years. He was stuck for 10 years. Warburg at that point was in an asylum, in a kind of sanatorium, because he sort of had mental issues due to the research he was doing. The very short version of this, this may not be really correct, but sort of gives you a gist of it. He basically was permutating the matrix of how stuff is related to, and then he says he lost his distance. So we have machines, but it didn't go away. It's still actually complete, right? So the key thing is like Cassirer then gets him out of the sanatorium and says like, no, your idea is good. We need to do that. And so then he writes this philosophy of symbolic forms, which talks about religion, about culture, about literature, and about science, and so on. But in the science issue, like if you want to have a summary of this essay on man summarizes all this. There's an article about, or a chapter about science, and there in the first line he says, I don't really need to extend this here because my philosophy of science is lined out in my earlier work, including substance and function. Because humanists read this, if they read it, and not this, because this has only to do with science, they read that maybe first footnote and then never go to substance and function because they're humanists, right? So why should I read that? Actually, he does something really interesting in the second volume here. He summarizes everything he knows about the constitution of space from his philosophy of science into 3 pages. And that will be the next slide, actually. The key thing why you probably know Cassirer, at least from hearsay, is he is also a Kantian philosopher, and there was this very famous debate in Davos. That's the original Davos debate. Like before Davos, like World Economic Forum, at the same place, this thing was like, was you know, for a philosophical debate, it's a little bit like, I don't know, Laszlo Barabasi and Aaron Closet doing something on stage at Netzai. So it turned out that Heidegger was then later the Kantian philosopher that supported the Nazis, and Cassirer had to emigrate because he was Jewish. And that is sort of the moment when this split happened. So it's very interesting and very important for the intellectual history of Europe. And then later, Cassirer wrote this, The Myth of State, how the mythical, like weird beliefs into fake news, sort of can sort of lead to people idiotically following some leader figure that actually has no formation or you know, education to do so. And this book is actually something that Albert Speer, one of the few surviving close party members of the Nazis, he was the architect of Hitler, read in jail, and he said when he read that article, he understood how stupid he was in following Hitler. So the interesting thing is like all this multidisciplinary philosophy ends up in this one article. And Cassirer unfortunately died one day before Vienna was liberated in New York City of a heart attack because he knew probably of the Holocaust, which did not make it to the front page of the New York Times, but every Jew knew, right? So it's really interesting what's happening here. Okay, so philosophy of science. Somebody wants to take a picture? No, yeah, whatever. This is, you can look it up. Okay, so how does this all come together? So Cassirer in 1910, Substance and Function, is actually bringing, not only hanging on Leibniz, but it brings together 2 ideas which are super crucial for us too. One is, he's fully aware of the math developed by Hilbert, which leads to Hilbert spaces in quantum mechanics. Multidimensional space, that is metric, right? So that's the interesting thing. Like once you get that, there's lots of thoughts you can have. And as you know, you work with these multidimensional vector spaces all the time, many of you, right? And the other thing he was fully aware of, he got a really good grasp of cognition in a sense that in the US, for example, is only in wider use since the cognitive revolution in 1956 with Miller, Chomsky, and so on, which basically assumes that we have a symbolic representation in our brain. So if I imagine these classes, I don't have, like Fechner thought, I don't have like inverse classes in my head, but there's a point that's connected to all the other points that sort of together symbolize the classes. This is what Cassirer thought was this kind of simplicial complexes and symbolic forms. And Helmholtz, so he has this from Helmholtz, who already had that idea. Helmholtz is a kind of scary person. He's like Leibniz. He was like in acoustics and optics. Like his principles of optics, first published in 18-something, 70, I think, 70-something in German, is basically still used as the textbook in optics. There's a little change. So he's really cool. And so from there, you can then make a comparison to, okay, what do art historians actually think? Like, let's assume Cassirer really got an idea of like how we think when we read cognitive science, we read visualization stuff, we sort of know the foundations of network science and stuff like that. Like, let's just assume, it's obviously not the case, but let's assume he had sort of a really good idea. Like, this is what he's confronting. There's this guy Schmarzow in 1893 who says the three-directional axes are defined even in the smallest cellular nucleus of every concept of space. Does it sound familiar? Like people create these GIS, geographical information systems, and think social interaction happens in layers of maps in a geographic database, which may have dynamics over time on which you can model with equations, right? Now that's the problem. Like, obviously you can do nice little pictures, but if Cassirer says, no, there's multidimensional space going on, it's really hard to visualize, but it's actually, we have to think of it multidimensional. So basically, this thing up here is still common practice in digital art history. If you look at the literature, whenever they talk about space, they usually talk about 3 dimensions, with the exception of deep learning papers obviously referring to sort of multidimensional results, right? So we should not accept this as the state of the art because it's not true. So there is other notions, and so obviously the humanities didn't sleep. So I just mentioned one example. There's a really interesting book by David Summers, who's an art historian, who wrote this huge brick called Real Spaces in 2003, and he discerns basically 3 types of spaces. He says there's psychophysical space, which is the space you have to assume it's anisotropic, is like basically what you see, right? So it's basically what you have in front of you. It's sort of hemicircular, and there is things going on. There's stuff a little denser here, then it's out here, and stuff like that. So that's like one notion of space he's thinking of. He calls it psychophysiological space. And then he says there is meta-optical space, which is the space we convene on, that there is latitude, longitude, and altitude, right? And that's a 3-dimensional coordinate system, which obviously is spherical because we have Earth, but nevertheless, it's different from this psychophysiological space, which we may totally make up, right? Like right now, if I touch this table, this area is much larger in terms of like what's represented than whatever is over there, right? And then he says there's other spaces, virtual space, social space, etc., which he doesn't really go into. But these 2 spaces, that's a really interesting distinction. They reappear in art history with Panofsky in the iconology, where he also says there's psychophysiological space, which is anisotropic and unhomogeneous, which you can divide into facial space, which is basically what you can see, and tactical space is what you can touch, right? And then there is this Euclidean space of geometry. So if you talk about architecture, in other words, you need to talk about what you can perceive and how it's actually embedded in my 3-dimensional grid, which is a difference. So he wrote this article called Perspective as Symbolic Form. He says that perspectival depiction is not depicting reality. It's a convention. We agree that it depicts reality, even though it is wrong. And most 3-dimensional depictions are wrong. Okay, so actually, Summers has it from Panofsky, and Panofsky has it from Cassirer. And as you can see, it says around 1925. What's really interesting is Cassirer publishes in 27, Panofsky publishes in 27, But they both come up with it in a talk in 1925. Okay? Let me show it the time. Let me look at the time. Yeah. So they both come up with it in 1925. And you have to imagine this as a water cooler or white wall discussion in the Warburg Institute. So they stand together and they pitch each other ideas. That's how Panofsky picks up psychophysiological space. Okay? And also symbolic form as a concept. And actually Panofsky says that, but Panofsky doesn't really get what Cassirer means. And this is what actually Cassirer summarizes. He has 4 types of space, and because it's not easy to describe the space verbally, he does a good old Catholic trick. He writes a litany. Andrea Baronchelli would call this a naming game, which is what it is. So if you cannot describe something with like 3 words, you describe it from multiple sides, and you call it the space of pure knowledge, the space of geometric intuition, the thought space of pure mathematics, the thinking space of geometry, the pure space of geometry, the geometric conceptual space, and the abstract space of pure knowledge. Now you have a much better idea of what he was up to, right? So, and he says this is hard to explain, but it's different from metric space, which is the 3-dimensional grid which we draw our drawings in. And it's also different from what he calls the sensual space of perception, seeing and tactical space, facial space and tactical space, which he calls the 2 physiological spaces. Interesting, right? So the key thing is, Cassirer makes a distinction between the physiological, like the stuff that hits your retina, and the psychological, which is the stuff you have in mind once you saw it, right? And as you all know, if you study a little bit of cognition, 80% of whatever you see right now comes out of your own brain, right? And so this is obviously important. And then Cassirer and Warburg both have this idea there's this 4th thing called mythical space, because in Neolithic times, or in, say, around 1200, metric space was not fully developed. The latitude-longitude grid we now all use was convened on in 1851. Before that, people had different metrics. At some point, people didn't know how the eyes work. People had a different concept of how people think, right? And so what they say, there's this other thing, which is called mythical space, where all these other spaces convene into one. They fall into one thing, which is hard to discern, where you can't decide if this rock is a rock, or if it has agency, or if it's divine, or if it's a part of yourself. You don't know. As you know, there's many religions that basically make premises like that, right? So this is the kind of science way to see it, and then they say there is this mythical way, which is this thing they want to know. Actually, Warburg said at the last year of his life, what I want to know right now is how we went from mythical space to the enlightened world of Giordano Bruno. Like, how did that transition happen? How did we end up where we are right now, right? But let's leave that out. I just want to basically mention it, that this exists, which is interesting. Okay, so here I repeat the litany for the thought space, and this is what Cassirer says in Substance and Function, and this is now really interesting because this loops back to Leibniz. What Cassirer means with the litany becomes crystal clear when he explains that the elements or points that connect and to constitute geometric space are nothing else but positional situations, that's the German word Lagebestimmungen, which have no content outside these relations. Their being taken up in their mutual situation is a purely functional, not a substantial being. So he implies, he uses the word generating mechanisms. So we need to do a science of thought space. That's what's going on. And he says already in 1910, again, it's the Leibnizian foundational conception of mathematics to which we see ourselves guided back to. So this is how it all comes together. So this slide sort of connects the whole thing to quantum mechanics and physics. I don't want to go into detail there. But basically he says Hilbert's math is a method of pure mathematics, the pure doctrine of relationship. And this is basically a summary where this all applies. Leibniz monadology, which is a thing in philosophy, In quantum mechanics, you have Hilbert spaces, you have vector spaces in machine learning, you have feature spaces in data science. Feature spaces means the matrix contains other things other than zeros and ones or numbers. You may just write in like the department of the museum in which the object is based, and that's just a column of your matrix, right? The cursive dimensionality is obviously related to that in data visualization. Bipartite classification in libraries is related to that because it's literally, and we'll get to that, the librarian of the Warburg Institute, who also did her PhD in Leibniz and later became the director, said, oh, there's new books coming in, I have to put them into the situation they belong to, into their Lagebestimmungen, right? So she basically thought about the library as this kind of like a Leibnizian sort of network. And obviously, the kinds of relation things, which we talked about before, which is also already in Leibniz, that's related to multi-layer networks and network science. And the big picture I showed you with the 80 different link types, in essence, right? So this thing leads to this systematic framework of Cassirer. And so this is now a little difficult. We talked about space. And now the key thing is, what does he make of it, of this whole thing? What are the ingredients for a systematic science of art and culture, right? Like if I say, we don't talk about people, and I said we talk about cultural products, but the actual thing is, if we, I don't know, how many of you are familiar with Cesar Hidalgo's book about how information is sort of fossilized into objects, right? So here's the thing. This thing down here has indeed a lot of information encoded into it, and sort of it gives us air. But you have a different idea than you about this thing, right? If you've never seen one of these rectangular fans, you say, what's this, right? If you know that it's a fan, that's okay. So the key issue is that much of the information about this object is encoded in your brain. It's not part of the object. That Darth Vader does an inverse pieta is not part of the image. It's not a property of the image. It's a property of my thoughts about that image. And I know it from somewhere else, and I compare it. And that's really interesting. That's the reason why the real subject of our systematic science of art and culture is this thought space. We want to know the shape and form of the thought space and not the shape of objects. That's the interesting part. Okay, so this is like how this ties to Warburg and our art history, but let me give you a little summary of the general systematic reference framework of thought. So Cassirer says he wants to differentiate the issue of symbolic form in all its disciplinary specific and permutations while putting the issue in a meaningful multidisciplinary framework. That's awesome, right? There's a meaningful multidisciplinary framework he proposes which can help us to bridge these gaps in the multidisciplinary landscape where we never find the right reviewers. And so this is art history, okay? So in art history, the idea is the following. So if you imagine I'm a painting. The first thing you see is the natural subject matter. So you see a human body, right? With legs, arms, head. That's something, if you're human yourself and you ever looked into a pond, you probably recognize this. Then there is the conventional subject matter. Like if you're not familiar with academia, you would not know that I am speaking in an academic talk right now. But because you've trained in the convention, you know that this configuration is an audience and a speaker. So you know I'm the speaker in a talk. That's the conventional subject matter, which if you have art history sources, that's what Panofsky says is known from written sources. And this becomes interesting. This is like what Wittgenstein calls when he talks about Satzung, right? Or sentence. So we get back to that. It's more than the written stuff. But then there's an intrinsic meaning, which needs much more. So basically you need all the ideas you have about me right now, all these thoughts which live in your brain. There may be things you cannot speak out, right? Like that's part of this, like the meaning layer. And so Panofsky calls these layers because the word Lage in German means layer in English. And so by definition, these three things in art history are discrete. They don't overlap. Now here comes Cassirer. He calls, this is where this original framework comes from. And so he calls it the expressive function, not layer, the representation function, and the meaning function. And so the expressive function is indeed basically what we do and what we perceive directly. The representational function is things that have conventions that are represented. And so he uses this word bestimmte Satzung, and that's the bridge to Wittgenstein. And there's a very interesting thing about Satzung. It's not only sentences, it's not only linguistics. Don't make the mistake to think a knowledge graph is a linguistic construct. It is not. There may be other things in there, right? For example, this Satzung may include things like physical theories. Like the second law of thermodynamics in German is called the second sentence of thermodynamics, and we all agree it's not a sentence. It's a formula, right? Or a whole theory. So he says physical theories, like if you write a model in a PRL paper, this is still part of this function. And then he says there is the actual meaning function going on. And the easiest way to understand is you fly on an airplane, you fly to turbulence or a thunderstorm. You know there is the Navier-Stokes equation that could describe whatever is going on. But the Navier-Stokes equation are this. And what's actually going on outside is this. Right? So there's something else happening. And the same is true for thought. There may be parts of cognition that are not just things you can write down. And so what's funny with Cassirer, he calls this functions or dimensions. And as you know in math, dimensions are not necessarily orthogonal to each other. You can ask the question, like, maybe the Navier-Stokes equation are actually fully describing what's going on, and then basically these two things become the same. Can this be the case if the word is like, if there's some continuity on a macro level? That's really hard because the equations are at least use symbols, which are discrete, so that's sort of not that easy, right? So the key thing is like, he is more general. And so instead of having a synthesis method, what he has is an analysis method. It's not about the substantial form, but a functional form. He's interested in the generating mechanism at what he calls laws of formation. And now, there is some space over there. It's all Leibniz. It's really interesting. So again, there's all these manuscripts, so it's really hard to do that. But so Gale in 1997 summarized all the manuscripts into one giant framework, which he calls Leibniz's complete system. And this explicitly includes the observable, the explanatory, and the metaphysical. And the metaphysical, as you know, is de calculo situm, is analysis situs, which is really cool, right? So this whole thing, all these four things sort of fall together. Okay. So one could say art and cultural history after Cassirer and network science after Euler are an intellectual ring species where horizontal meme transfer is possible if we sort of work our way into it. I left out one thing. I just want to mention one slide. So this is from the Algebra of Logic of Couturat. He uses these kind of symbols to do his logic. Shannon makes figures out of this. This makes it to electric circuits. It's really interesting. So this picture thing, which we still live on, we draw pictures all the time, right, is a really important thing. So not only does this lead to computation with all the logic gates and stuff like that, but that also is really a fundamental change of how we talk about sort of scientific matter. Yeah, I don't want to talk about this. So what do I do, right? So I use network science. I'm interested in topological data analysis. We use some computation, machine learning, computer vision. We talk about cognitive stuff to do art history. So my idea is all of what I'm doing can be summarized in these various aspects. Of course, I'm not saying that high order topology is the same as art history. But I can say we can have a conversation. We can actually maybe mutually help each other in other ways. And so basically, let me give you one example about what I'm doing right now. Has a lot to do with multiple kinds of relations. That was born in Leibniz, which was picked up by Warburg. Actually, Warburg, in his Memnosyne Atlas, he starts out with this plate, which says humans are inscribed into different systems of relations, cosmic, geographic and genealogic, so kinship, geographically and conceptually, in essence. And then he says, in mythical thinking, all these different relations collapse into one, because to separate the different kinds of relations already requires thinking, which if you're multidisciplinary, multi-layer, multiplex network scientist, is really funny if you think about the first 10 years of network science, where obviously less thinking was involved, obviously. This is Warburg's plates. Like, this is all of the similarity plates. Monument documentations are obviously not monuments, but objects looking similar. This is the conceptual dimension. Here is the kinship dimension, and here's the geographic dimension. So this is the life work of Abby Warburg, and that's all the other complexity we still have left to do stuff. And obviously these other things are not solved either, because all of looking at similar images in deep learning is still in that cell, right? And so basically, I told you before, with this thing I could do this, my PhD and the science paper. But the question is, how can we get further, right? And so let me get back to these two words of complexity and complication. Are there any questions at this point? More fun slides ahead. Okay, so I know this is all very complicated. What I told you until now, particularly all the slides where there's no images in there, is published in the chapter. So if you go to my Twitter account at SchichMax, you can download that paper. It doesn't include the figures yet. They will be published in the book. What I do now is I tell you what I did before, which is the application of all this. So we talk about complication and complexity. You know me as somebody who does network stuff. And you know, if you go back to this is obviously network science, right? Which is about complexity. So here we proved that in this cultural data, complexity emerges from granular interactions. But we didn't talk about complication, and I want to talk about complication. So what I will present to you is qualitative work, which I did before I joined Laszlo's lab, which is heavily pertinent for what you do in deep learning. Okay? So let's get back to Abby Warburg's atlas. How do these images end up there? So here's some opaque algorithm of similarity, right? So we don't know how that exactly works. But here, he obviously selects human body poses, okay? We already had that. People start out with this. We get out all the human poses. We get all out the faces. And then we do something interesting with it, like we embed them in some GAN machine to do artificial portraits and stuff like that, right? So we cut out the human figures. That's the first step of classification. And then we take the human figures and we micro-classify them into some into gestures, into things. This, by the way, is not Jesus. This is like some random dude on an ancient sarcophagus. And this is like the desperation kind of gesture, whatever. So you can do stuff like that. Obviously, you can do this now with machines. Actually, as you know, at this given moment, probably hundreds of millions of these decisions are made by video cameras and artificial neural networks behind it. So that's taken from a paper, forgot which one, but if you Google human pose estimation, it's literally one of the first 3 papers that comes up. That this is not really easy and subject to like weird stuff. You can see in this thing, like here, I did the same thing. I said like, okay, I take human poses that look like this guy, that's Laocoon. Turns out this is obviously related. There's even a snake around here. But this guy here, who is the favorite model of Caravaggio, has the same head tilt. There's no snake. This thing is actually related to this thing. It's not related to this thing. This is from 16-something. This was only found in 18-something. So key take home, be very cautious with causality in essence. But the key thing is you could actually write a lot of things. Like here you have wings, here you have wings. This guy never knew this guy, for example. So in other words, that's what's going on. The rheology of cats. There's a fluid dynamics of objects going on, right? You can get out the images, right? And you can say, okay, let's get all the cats and then talk about cats. But get all the cats is a really huge problem, right? So that is an Ig Nobel Prize paper by a guy called Fardin. Awesome. There's more pictures about cats in the paper, so you should totally download it. So what I worked on is the rheology of ruins. Okay, that's slightly, this almost looks like a cat, right? If you squint. So this is all the same ruin. It's interesting, right? So and obviously, if you do this long enough, you basically have to mount certain things. You have to cut out pieces. This is a Roman bath. This is something from a Roman bath. Sometimes you have to take drawings and combine them in order to make them comparable. And then you have this bipartite classification between depiction types and drawings. And if you do this long enough in a PhD and nobody stops you doing and you don't talk to your advisor, you end up with this, which is 10,000 of these decisions, right? And then you can ask the question, what are you doing with this? Obviously, you can quantify this. You get a Powell law. You get a postdoc in Boston, and so on. Or you can do more art history. In this particular case, this is a picture I want to show you because we talk about similar stuff. What you see here is a Roman city map that's almost empty. Only the blue stuff shows you ruin of Roman baths. This is the most frequent bath. This is a matrix of Roman baths over time, and every column is a document. And whenever I color them blue, it's only the ruins are documented that are actually where there's a large fraction of stuff going on. And you can see, actually, this map is 1 year older than this map. As you can see, antiquarians, they had written sources for 31 baths, and they said like, oh, I know there's 300 by 300 meters in size. I just fill up the map with Roman baths. And that's how I have a worldview of all of Rome. Does it remind you of something? You have tagged images, and then there's lots of images that are not tagged. So you basically go out and you tag, you use machine learning, look at similarity, and you propagate your tags. That doesn't fill your map. That's actually this other thing, where people say, oh, I take the information I know, but I know this room over there exists in this ruin, and here there's a gap, so I take this room and put it in here. And then I have more ruins. And this is the red thing. This is called the inductive method. That's the birth of archaeology here. So here people look at ruins, then people think about like what they can see, and they make sense-making decisions in order to come up with a canon, in this case of depictions, that actually fills up the map. Let me look at the time. Yeah, okay. And so the key question is, how does this happen? And this is, I hope this is a lesson that you can use while doing these kind of inductive reasonings and long pipelines. So here's the thing. Over 650 years, there's what I call the cycle of sample and remix. You go to the ruin, 300 by 300 meters, these things are large. You draw little drawings, you integrate these drawings, you integrate them to full reconstruction, and then, because this is hard to unwieldy, what you do is you fragment them again. Meaning you pick out things which you can actually put in your paper as a figure, for example, and then you recombine them. Because other people read the papers with the little fragments, and they write new papers, and they never saw your full reconstruction. And then there's people who actually take the process more artistic and basically do sample and remix, literally like Grandmaster Flash with music samples, and basically create new objects. Okay? So here, this is sampling, layering and separation, like red chalk and ink. First you do a rough drawing in red, and then you add ink. This is Bramante 1504. Here you have multiple repetitions of a part where you put in different measures. You go on, and you create something like this. In this case, 22 sections through the building and a ground plan, which you can take and integrate. Here, lots of measurements. You draw things twice. There's reference letters. This is the birth of reference letters. And then you create a geometrically congruent drawing here, right? And there you don't need measures, because you can take a ruler and just measure any measure you want, which is really cool. This is from the integration phase. This is already refragmented. So basically, the left half is this, and the right half is this. So archaeologists and art historians always thought that drawings are either taken from the ruin or they're publication drawings. They never thought about this feedback process where people take whatever is published, sample again, and then recombine again. And that basically, this is what's happening. This is 4 very famous artists, and whatever is red are mounting mistakes of recombinations. And why do I tell you all this? There's one particular artist, Andrea Palladio, who gives you the 4 different modes of how you come up with a new depiction. The first one is in the upper register. You actually go to the ruin and you measure with these drawings. This is the actual ruin from another Vedute. This is his reconstruction, his inductive reconstruction. And the gray part is the only realistic part of that reconstruction. So propagated tags, right? As you know, in Flickr, there's like 260,000 images on Rome with tags and 5 million without tags. You propagate your tags from the 260,000. You may end up with something like this that looks realistic and nice, but only 5% is actually accurate. There may be lots of other things you miss that go on. Peer sharing. He had drawings from other people, and there was white space, so he filled them up with other drawings. This thing has been translated to these larger reconstructions, which are integrated into larger reconstructions. This is all drawings from his collections, where he has mounting mistakes because he forgot to download that particular data, right? So that is information taken from other documents, from others. From the ruin, from other documents. This is from other monuments. Here he comes up to this reconstruction. This is the most famous Roman bath in Rome, which is completely made up by Andrea Palladio. The rooms that should be in the south are in the north, so the sun cannot warm them. And everything that is red is taken from other ruins. Okay, so you have now 3 sources. The actual ruin, other documents about that ruin, and other monuments. And then finally, there is obviously something which is the most prolific thing people use to do stuff, which is their own mind. So he had the equivalent of the Mercedes star, his Palladium motif, which you know is in every second house in American suburbs. And this is the same section, and he puts it in different places in the same section. So he often designs what looks best, okay? So this ends up in one summary. This is the semantic triad. There is no relation between the drawing and the object. It goes through cognition via perception and action, and that cognition uses other objects, other documents, and imagination. If you do deep learning or machine learning, place your artificial neural network up here and ask the question, what does it do? You can answer ethical questions with this. Okay, so that's the idea. Okay, I think I have 5 minutes left. So I want to just mention this. The key thing is like, how does this all work? We use pipelines like this that have feedback, right? This is visualization, design, this is data science, this is machine learning, and all of them have feedback. This is an obvious contradiction to regular art history and humanities, where you have some data model and philosophy about the real world. You have a data collection, which you collect according to this, like the libraries, a book in the libraries. You do some qualitative thinking, and then you write a publication. But there is no feedback. It's hard. But right now, if you add all these feedback pipelines, quantitative inquiry comes in, which produces more quantitative inquiry, which produces more qualitative inquiry. Large-scale data collection leads to more data collection. Large-scale data modeling leads to more data modeling. And because you quantify, you do mathematical modeling. That all feeds into itself, and in a circle produces a hypercycle. And short story, the hermeneutics circle is you have a big worldview, and you look at a particular specific detail with that worldview. So I've read lots of art history books. I look at a painting that tells me something about the general worldview, may modify it. I modify that, and then I look at specifics, and that may again look different. But it takes a long time. But with this thing, this looks like an enzymatic hypercycle, as introduced by Eigen and Schuster. This means because these things feed back to themselves and they feed into each other. As long as there's fuel, this field will grow exponentially. This is 2 examples. One is the citrus cycle in the human cell, and the other thing is the carbon cycle in the sun. Why the human cell? Why do I show you this? This is the keg. This is all the metabolic pathways in the human cell. That cycle is just here, and there's all this other stuff going on. How can we compare this? There may be a procedure that I need to produce tomato sauce, right? Which is not integral to my research procedure, but it's out here, and without me producing tomato sauce, I will not be able to do this here. So we're embedded in this kind of ecocosmos, and people have different ideas about their pipelines, and now we come up with this, and this accelerates exponentially, which leads to people who don't have that hypercycle to be very afraid. They think, oh my God, they take all my turf. These computational social scientists, they're going to ruin all my sociology because I need 20 years to write the paper, right? So that's a really interesting thing. That's the reason why science of science is necessary. And then final thing, let me give you an example. This is the hairball which we used backbone filtering and community finding in 2010 to produce this picture, which is more structured, which is the community network. I don't want to go into detail, so this is something I came up with Michele Koscha. But what's important is this is the pipeline we used. And that pipeline is basically a signal processing pipeline where you can fix some knobs and others you can play with. So it's literally like a synthesizer where you have some signal coming in and something beautiful coming out, which may be rigorous or not. So the interesting thing is this thing obviously goes into this thing. It's somewhere located here and may influence the qualitative inquiry. That's the idea. Okay? So I hope I gave you a little overview of what this all entails. I don't expect you understand it all. I hope you don't consider me nuts. And I hope you will read my book once it comes out. This article is already out. Thank you very much.